Hey, what's up, witches? I'm back with part 3 of my Norse paganism and Druidry series. So for this final part, get your tinfoil hats on because I'm taking you on a comparative mythology deep dive. Specifically, I wanted to examine some similarities between Odin, or at least what I see as some aspects of Odin, and what you'll see of Druids in some of the myths from Ireland, Wales, and continental Europe as well, but specifically not just Odin and the Druids or Druidic practices that I see in some of his aspects and stories, but also similarities with the Irish figure known as the Dagda. So let's get into it. So first, let me just touch on a few more similar aspects that I've noticed between Odin and what we know from some of the Norse deities from those stories, and some of what we know from the practices of the peoples of the Germanic, Gallic, and Britannic tribes, etc., etc. Just as Odin is the one who discovered the runes and gave them to mankind, we have this figure in Irish lore known as Ogma, and he was the creator of Ogham, which is the tree alphabet, which I'm also very into. And coming up, I'm going to be doing a live stream. I think that will be after this video comes out, where I'll be talking about a book that I just read called Celtic Tree Magic. Yeah, because the other one I have by the same author is Celtic Tree Rituals. So now I've read the other one, and I'm going to talk about that. In addition to that, we also know that the Germanic and Gallic tribes and the Druids worshipped not in temples per se, but in the sacred groves. Not only that, but we know that from some writings, the Druids placed a special significance on mistletoe, which in the Norse myths is the plant that led to or contributed to the death of Balder. So I'm not really sure what else to make of that. I just thought it was an interesting coincidence to just make note of. So from what we can tell of the Druids, they were learned or educated men who, while they advised chiefs and kings, they themselves did not rule or hold direct rulership over the lands that they inhabited. They were more just in charge of the religious rites and presiding over sacrifice, and also performed some divination to give prophecies or just predict the outcomes of battles or things like that. Yeah, really? It's dinner time. So, from what we know of the Druids themselves, they were more in charge of religious rites, presiding over sacrifices and rituals, and they also would perform various types of divination in order to give prophecies, perhaps predict weather or crop outcomes, and also predict the outcome of battle, which I think also ties in some aspects of Odin as not only a god of battle, but also a god of magic and battle magic specifically. In Tacitus, he describes some of the Germanic tribes as using this technique that he calls baritus, where they would use chants or incantations before a battle in order to strike fear into the enemy. The Druids were also said to be able to use battle magic in order to do things like blunt the weapons of the enemy, or incite fear in them, or to incite battle lust in your side and your soldiers to get them amped up. and even to control the weather. I saw some instances where Druids were able to like summon mists and things like that. And in Norse mythology, we also know that Odin has many of these same abilities. And so, as I said, he's not just a god of war or a god of magic, but also a god of wisdom and knowledge, which to me are also traits of a druid or someone who would hold that class or role in society. I just think it's interesting that, you know, Odin especially has many different facets and aspects, as do all of these different deities. When I get into these comparative mythology deep dives that I really am interested in and want to do more of here on the channel, and before I get into this one on similarities between Odin and the Dagda specifically, I kind of just wanted to preface it with just this general disclaimer. Go eat your dinner. Go eat your dinner. Go eat your nom-noms. And yes, I know you're a nice boy. So while I'm going to be talking about just some similar traits and aspects that I see in tales of Odin and the Dagda, I just wanted to preface it with a disclaimer that I am not saying they're the same god. I'm not trying to lump them all in under one category, because someone left a really good comment on my last video on Druidry, and it's also a good point that I've seen brought up in just some other videos and articles and books that I've been reading on this and just other topics under paganism in general, that I think it is important not to fall down what can sometimes be a slippery slope of trying to basically, in my view, whitewash or colonialize these myths and traditions from around the world, especially as we explore some of these world myths that have some similar Proto-Indo-European roots and things like that, which are always of general interest to me. It's just important for me to distinguish that I'm not trying to lump all of these things, all of these stories, and all of these groups and cultures into just one big group and say, you know, that all these stories just come from this one people or this one story, and that this was like the biggest, greatest one. I think it's important, even though I love exploring comparative mythology and finding similar traits and aspects and stories among all these different peoples and cultures, that I don't want to just conflate them all or say that they're all this, like Odin and the Dagda and Jupiter and Deus Peter are just all the same god, because while I do like exploring some of the like Proto-Indo-European roots of a lot of these myths and traditions, they have all branched out and evolved so vastly over time and over the millennia. And as they made their way to different peoples and met and merged with those cultures and locations and climates, that's where we really get into these localized traditions and practices that are so unique to those people and those times and those locations. And that can be what's probably the most hard for us to try to reconstruct and reproduce, is those intricacies. We know that, to tie it back to one of my other videos, the Roman peoples had this concept of the lares and the penates, ancestral deities or deities of specific places, that we also see in things like the Landvatir and Husvatir and like Aesir and Alfar and Disir and things like that. And to me, that's also where exploring things like folklore and even fairy tales can come into play, which is also something I would like to do more of upcoming here on this channel, because I think that really can give us a glimpse or a window into what some of those local folk beliefs and traditions might be. because while they might all be able to trace themselves from some ancestral root, it's also important, I think, to distinguish that I'm not trying to lump any of these deities or beliefs into one overarching group and say that they're all the same. But that being said, I was watching an interesting video recently from Fortress of Lugh all about the Dagda, and also reading the book that I just have an ebook copy of, Celtic Myth and Legend, and reading all about the Tuatha Dé and the Irish mythological cycle in that book, and reading about that and learning about the Dagda specifically. There are just, as I said, just some similar facets and traits and aspect that I think remind me personally, just in my own UPG with Odin, of his aspect as what I'm kind of calling a Druidic priest king. And I'll explore that concept a little bit more as we get deeper into the video. What can I tell you about the Dagda? Well, his name means the good god, and he kind of gets his origins more as an earth deity, whereas Odin is kind of more of a sky god or an air deity, especially tied to air as like the tarot type element of intellect and communication. Here, the good god means good as in skilled or good at many things. Much like the god Lugh, and really like Odin, he is very good, skilled, or talented in many aspects. In one of the Dagda's aspects, he is also a lord of the Sidhe and the burial mounds, which are passages to the other world, which is not only considered to be kind of a land of the Fae or these otherworld beings, but it's also in some ways an underworld or land of the dead. And I'm going to make a whole separate video all about the otherworld and exploring that concept and what it is, because it's not quite the same as an underworld. In Norse mythology, we definitely see a very distinguished underworld in the cosmology, but as kind of an earthly deity, to distinguish him from more atmospheric or celestial deities, he is also a god of burial mounds and thusly this kind of otherworldly realm and the people that inhabit it, as I think are many of the Tuatha Dé, which he is a part of. Some of his other epithets are, and I apologize, one thing I will apologize for on this channel is if I butcher the traditional pronunciation of some of these names, but he is also called Eochaid Olahair, Horseman Great Father, which in his traditions and mythological cycles is not quite the same thing as some of Odin's aspects as a horseman, a rider of Sleipnir, and kind of a rider into battle, but Horseman Great Father. It does kind of have some of those similar echoes, especially while Olathar is not the same as Allfather. It has similar connotations as far as what their roles might have been. He was also called Ruad Rofhesa, Mighty of Great Knowledge, which is very similar to Odin as a god of knowledge and wisdom, but also called the Dark One, perhaps in relation to him being more earthly in his ventures and his realms of origin, and also called the Horned Man. He is also known as Dagda of Songs, and is a great sage, healer, bard, and a god of not just, druidry or magic, but also hospitality, which features very largely in Norse mythology as well, and specifically in the Havamal, or Words of the High One. You'll see a lot of guidelines regarding hospitality. This also features very broadly across a lot of these myths. Dagda was known to have a magic cauldron, which would kind of never run out of food to feed all of his armies. And among his other magic, he was said to know not just battle magic, as Odin does, but also, much like Odin, he was explicitly said to practice witchcraft, or in the translations of the original text, a word which is a word for arts usually known and practiced by women, much as Odin learned Sadir, a magic which was traditionally only known and practiced by women. So I thought that was just kind of another very interesting coincidence, which I think just perhaps might speak to deities of knowledge and just being willing to not only willing, but wanting to acquire all knowledge, no matter what its origin or where it comes from. It's all equally important and worth having. Much like Odin and his magic horse Sleipnir and his magic spear Gungnir, the Dagda also has several magical items, which I think also can kind of hearken to that imagery of Odin with his traveling staff or walking staff as that Gand elf or wand elf figure. He has a staff, the Dagda has a magical staff called Lorog Aduathmar, which was the dreadful or abominable staff, which can kill or remove the breath of life from a person with one end and restore the breath of life with the other. Just as Odin was also said in Norse cosmology and origin myths to be the one that gave the breath or spark of life to mankind, and to be not only, a god of magic and battle, but also a god of death. The Dagda also has this magical stave which can not only take away life, but also restore life. This also reminds me specifically of the rune Elhaz, which kind of represents like both the balance of life and death, and to me just the shape of it also resembles like a double-ended staff or stave, or just like a double-ended weapon or something of the like, which perhaps could, like the Dagda staff, give life with one end and take it away with the other. But that's just kind of me and my own personal gnosis to throw in there as far as a specific Norse pagan tie-in. As I said, he was also a god of hospitality, as, not only a battle god, but just as Odin has the never-ending feasts in Valhall, the Dagda has a bottomless cauldron which can feed an entire army and not be emptied. And much like Odin in his role as like what they call a psychopomp or a ferryman of souls, the Dagda can also travel to and from the land of the dead, and in death, kings feast eternally in his hall, much like Odin chooses the finest among the slain to feast in his hall in Valhalla. From some of the stories, the Dagda is also somewhat of a cunning and trickster figure as well, much like Odin, often going by many different names and disguises. But unlike Odin, Dagda was also, as I said, more commonly viewed as an earth god, and so he also had these tie-ins that we see in kind of Druidic tradition and practice, and in a lot of these mythologies from the Isles, specifically of assuming this role as not just an earth god, but a fertility god and a god of the fertility of crops and agriculture. Perhaps this is why he is called skilled at so many things. He's able to fill so many different roles. In Rolleston's Celtic myth specifically, he theorizes that while the common folk may have viewed these deities both in Irish, Welsh, and Norse myth as just kind of personifications of nature and natural forces. We see a lot of, like in the Norse stories specifically, a lot of them are very more like lighthearted and almost comedic in nature, or at least when taken at face value. But Rolleston kind of claims that while the everyday common folk would have viewed these deities and their stories just more as personifications of nature and the natural elements, the Druid class saw them more as embodiments of virtues and ideas, which I think perhaps the skalds, or at least the poems being handed down in oral tradition, might have been meant to convey more than just can be seen at face value as well. Because I do think that some of the stories and some of the Jotun in particular, like we have the frost giants, which personify more of those primal forces of nature and things like that. But I think these stories, since they were meant to be handed down and passed down through oral tradition, were also meant to convey a lot of different layers of information deeply embedded within their metaphors. And so to people that had these higher levels of training, they would know what was to be gleaned from these tales and taken to be metaphors for perhaps deeper layers of meaning and information, but which was put down into a format which could be easily remembered and digested and regurgitated for others, and then remembered and passed down. In Rolleston, he also talks about how much like Odin, the Dagda, as a god of the afterlife, they both kind of contain some aspects of this Dis Pater figure, which Caesar claims that the Gauls descended from. And he was just this god that of not just knowledge, much like Odin, but magic and songs. We know that it was also Odin who gave us not just the runes, but the inspiring mead of poetry and song. To kind of explore these similar aspects deeper, we know that the Druid order had 3 different classes, as I kind of touched on in my last video, which was the bards, the ovates or vates, and the druid. And Tacitus tells us that Germanic society was classified basically along the lines of chiefs or chieftains and warriors. So to me, I feel like if we want to really follow that tripartite system that so many people love, one that I kind of noticed that we can find in both of these societies is that we can break not only deities, but perhaps some of these social classes down along this tripartite system, which I see as being the king or the ruler, the warrior, and the sage. Perhaps one of the reasons that Odin ascended to the top of the pantheon, perhaps even over other war gods like Tyr, was because he, like the good god, was skilled at many things and was able to fulfill all of these needed roles in society. If you needed a god of war, he's got not just your battle and your war tactics, but also your battle magic. He's also kind of a skald or a bard. He has the meat of poetry and inspires poetry and song in others. And he's also a god of knowledge, wisdom, and learning. So he's able to fulfill that sage, shaman, or druidic role in society as well. He contains all of these different elements, not just of a druid or a druidic class, but also of the warrior and the king. If you kind of wanted to examine some other pantheons, you would see that I think most commonly in Norse cultures and societies, you would see either a system of Odin, Thor, and then either Freyr or Njord, fulfilling some of more of those agricultural earthly deity roles that we see the Dagda performing here. But also on that side, you would often find the Dagda and then Nuada and Lugh as part of this system of gods that were kind of more commonly talked about, especially in the myths, and revered. And so I think this also, if we do want to kind of pull in the Proto-Indo-European and Vedic roots, I see it as being kind of an alternate version of a triad that we see there, where it's not quite the same, because in that case it's creator, preserver, destroyer, where those roles are filled by Brahma, Vishnu, and Shiva. But we can also see perhaps like creator, preserver, and sustainer, creator, preserver, destroyer, all of these different things that can fulfill these different roles and different aspects in society. So just kind of sum everything up that I touched on in this video with comparing some of these similar aspects, as I said, especially between these two deities. My point is not to conflate the two and say that they're the same, because the more you examine their stories and the traditions and beliefs around them, they're very different and contain many different aspects that you will find in one that you won't in the other, and vice versa. It's more just to show you examples of why I personally do see aspects of Odin fulfilling that role of a druid or a priest king, if you will, where you would have some societies, such as perhaps like Egyptian societies, where those roles were kind of filled by the same person. The pharaoh was the embodiment of God on earth and also like the highest priest, the highest like religious authority. But with this, it's more just that, among his many roles, I do see Odin as a god of knowledge and magic, also having these resemblances to that Druidic figure. Continental, like Germanic, Anglo-Saxon paganism and the British Isles and those lands around the North Sea did share trade and traditions and intermingled amongst each other. I do think that it's worth examining all of these different deities and their stories and the folk beliefs and practices around them, just to compare and contrast in order to just help us as modern day pagans develop a clearer picture of how we can view, relate to, and honor these northern gods. Not only do we have the nature worship aspects seen in Druidic tradition that can be found all across many different types of paganism and pagan practice, but just this concept of being a well-rounded person, having knowledge of many different things. These druids, and I think as well a lot of these deities, such as the good god, skilled in many things. This concept of even like these Viking men, they could be very well-rounded men. We would see depictions of these Vikings and these men in these sagas, in the Icelandic sagas, where they were said to not only be very good warriors, but also good poets and skalds. So we do find these concepts in both societies of just being well-rounded and well-versed in your knowledge of not just crafts, but art, poetry, astronomy, astrology, divination. All of these things can just follow under a umbrella of more Druidic traditions and practices that I just really want to incorporate into my own personal practice, because I love me some auspices reading bird omens, let me tell you. In my own personal practice, as I said, I also do like using not only Norse runes, but also the Celtic ogham or tree language for magic and sigils specifically. In some of the previous videos, I touched on this overall concept of reincarnation and transmigration of souls that we see as not just a way for us to like level up and like purify our soul, which doesn't mean like purify is in becoming like pure and good and innocent, because perfection does not exist and the gods do not expect that of us, but it's just more like attaining a higher consciousness. And in my humble opinion, that is really what Odin is all about. And I think part of why he recruits among us mortal humans so actively, even still, and also why he can kind of be a little bit intense in it, because he, more than I think a lot of the other gods, wants us to be on his level. Whatever he's got to do to get us to get raised to his level so that we can help him with this whole preventing Ragnarok thing, that also just kind of speaks to his role as not just a deity of knowledge, but also just wanting us to attain knowledge in order to become our best self. I think I'm going to leave this video there. I hope that this kind of more comparative mythology deep dive was interesting to you guys, because I want to really do a lot more videos just doing comparative mythology deep dives, because it's just always been one of my favorite topics. I will see you in the next one. I have a whole swath of videos planned coming up for the month of October all about kind of some more spooky season related topics, and as I said, a whole video planned coming up very soon on the concept of the other world, so stay tuned for that. And until next time, stay classy, pagans.